Your Excellency, Ms. Navros Bukele-Thomas, Chief Executive Officer, African Union Development Agency New Partnership for African Development, distinguished representatives of the ISS Partnership Forum and supporters of this African Futures Conference, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, and heads of diplomatic missions in South Africa, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the African Futures and Innovation team here at the Institute for Security Studies, it is my honor to welcome you to the second African Futures Conference, held here in Pretoria and live streamed to participants across Africa and around the world. We also extend a warm welcome to our many colleagues joining us online, representing governments, research institutions, and civil society. Please note, as mentioned, that today's proceedings are not held under the Chatham House rules. They are open, transparent, and intended to stimulate dialogue that extends far beyond this room. The African Futures Conference is designed to strengthen Africa's capacity for foresight and evidence-based planning. It brings together policymakers, researchers, and foresight practitioners committed to shaping Africa's future. This year's theme, Insight, Imagination, Action, captures the full cycle of futures thinking. Insight, grounding African futures in credible data, evidence, and analysis. Imagination, where we re-envision continent's possibilities through creative foresight and bold thinking. And action, where we translate those visions into tangible policies, partnerships, and institutional reforms. Through these three pillars, our aim is to connect evidence to imagination and imagination to action, to ensure that foresight does not remain an academic exercise, but becomes a living practice that informs decision-making in Africa. We are also proud to launch the Africa Futures Report today, which explores Africa's long-term development trajectory and pathways to 2040. Over the next day and a half, we will engage with leading voices from across Africa and the world to explore data, share experiences, and strengthen our collective foresight ecosystem. Thank you for joining us and for your continued commitment and partnership in building Africa's future. My name is Elise Leroux, and it's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Fontaine, the Executive Director of the Institute, to welcome remarks. Fontaine.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, online participants, it's a distinct honor on behalf of the Institute for Security Studies to welcome you to the second African Futures Conference, framed around integrating insight, imagination, and action. And here, I would underline the word integrated. In 2025, we stand 5 years away from the transition to a post-SDGs agenda. 2 years into the second 10-year implementation window of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And we stand on the cusp of a new 5-year strategic cycle for the Institute for Security Studies, which kicks off next year, entitled Enhancing African Human Security in a Volatile World. These temporal markers are significant in a global context that is very much in temporal, geopolitical, material, and relational reconfiguration. Amid this reconfiguration, we are reminded of the opportunities for African states and societies in all of their diversity to play transformative roles in shaping potential into leverage. The African Futures and Innovations Program at the Institute for Security Studies demonstrates potential for trade, industry, energy, agriculture, technology through leapfrogging, demographics, and governance futures on the continent. Hence, we do have the tools at our disposal to reimagine inclusive global futures. All of that is evident in the enthusiastic response to the invitation to participate in the second African Futures Conference and the response that we see here in the room today and online. In order to transform potential into leverage, African states and societies need sustainability to drive global peace and stability. Global challenges such as pandemics and climate risks disproportionately affect the continent despite its resilience and strong capacity to rebound. Sustainable and actionable solutions to these challenges would benefit from African participation and inclusion. This conference, therefore, provides the space to imagine African participation to reform regional and multilateral systems and processes. The REACH program laid out before us over the next couple of days provides a tremendous opportunity to connect outside-the-box thinking with ambitious actionable pathways, data-driven policy and practice to transform Africa's potential into its leverage. As we continue in the ISS on our mission to advance human security in Africa, through analysis, technical support, and convenings such as this one, the ISS remains most grateful for the support of our partners within AFI, which are Ouda NEPAD, Sweden, the Netherlands, the Hans Seidel Foundation South Africa, and Humanity United. We are also grateful for the support of our other Partnership Forum members, Norway, Ireland, Denmark, the Millennium Trust in South Africa, the Open Society Foundations, and the European Union. We obviously benefit from the hospitality of a number of African governments who host the ISS headquarters and our regional offices as well. This include the Republic of South Africa, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Senegal, and Kenya. And we are grateful for that hospitality in hosting our headquarters and regional offices. I will end on a promise for next year. Next year, ISS will host the third African Futures Summit within the ambit of ISS at 35. ISS will be moving beyond the youth of the continent into adulthood as an institution, or I would say the middle age as an institution. And we hope that through that engagement next year, we'll be able to celebrate not just the accomplishments of 35 years as the institute, but 3 years of sustainable engagement within the framework of this conference itself. I would not end without being able to thank you for making the time to join us today, with the hope that you would stay with us till tomorrow to engage insightfully, imaginatively, but to have those provide the foundation for the kind of action that we seek to turn potential into leverage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonte. We are now going to turn to a video from Your Excellency, Ms. Nado Bekele Thomas, the Chief Executive Officer from Ouda NEPAD and one of our partners here at African Futures and Innovation.
Excellencies, distinguished participants and partners, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to address you during the second edition of the African Futures Conference, an inspiring platform that truly embodies the very essence of foresight and innovation. The theme of this year's conference, Insight, Imagination, Action, speaks powerfully to the essence of Africa's transformation journey. I had hoped to be with you in person today, but due to unavoidable circumstances, I am unable to do so. And I am addressing you from the beautiful Aswan in Egypt. Nonetheless, I am deeply honored and wish to commend the Institute for Security Studies and the African Futures and Innovation AFI program for creating this visionary platform that brings together Africa's finest and best minds to dream boldly and plan strategically for our collective future. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Agenda 2063, our blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global economic powerhouse of the future, is fundamentally a vision of foresight. It calls on us not only to respond to the challenges of today, but to respond and anticipate the opportunities and disruptions of tomorrow. At the African Union Development Agency, we see foresight as an indispensable aspect of our mandate. As the continent's premier development agency, our task is to ensure that long-term thinking informs immediate policy choices, that evidence drives planning, and that the Africa we envision in 2063 begins with decisions made today. With our continent-wide mandate covering areas such as infrastructure and trade, agriculture and climate change, human capital and skills development, digital transformation, health and peace, security and development nexus, among others, foresight is essential to guide how we invest, how we plan, how we innovate, and integrate across these sectors. To steer this vision forward, our NEPAD is guided by the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063 as a roadmap for Africa's next phase of accelerated transformation. It places foresight at the heart of planning, ensuring that our policies and programs are not only reactive to current challenges, but also anticipatory, evidence-based, and strategically aligned with the continent's long-term vision. It is for this reason that our collaboration with the AFI program is therefore both strategic and timely, representing one of the most dynamic and forward-looking initiatives on the continent. Its work is anchored on rigorous research and a continually updated forecasting platform that analyzes Africa's development prospects across multiple dimensions, from demographics and governance to health, infrastructure, and financial flows. By offering independent, evidence-based projections and scenario modeling, AFI equips policymakers, civil society, the private sector, and regional institutions with the analytical tools to anticipate change and design strategic responses. To strengthen these efforts, the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, is working closely with our universities, learning institutions, and research centers across the continent. These are the incubators of innovation and foresight, nurturing the next generation of thinkers and practitioners who will shape Africa's long-term trajectory and offer homegrown solutions. This important work, ladies and gentlemen, is further supported by tools such as the Africa 2040 Futures Report being launched today. I wish to extend my heartfelt congratulations to ISS and the AFI program and all partners involved for this outstanding achievement. The report exemplifies how to translate evidence-based research into actionable development policy and complements the African Union Development Agency's efforts to institutionalize foresight across member states. Excellencies, in conclusion, the Africa we want is one where our people are empowered to shape their own destinies, where innovation and foresight guide decision-making, where resilience is built not out of necessity, but by design. It is a continent of confident voices and visionary leadership rooted in our values, driven by knowledge and united by purpose. By working together to translate knowledge, evidence, and research into tangible impact and transformative outcomes, we can make the Africa we want not a distant aspiration, but a living reality. I thank you.
Of our program, which captures really the heart of this year's theme, which is insight, imagination, and action. So our first keynote represents the insight pillar. This will be delivered by Dr. Yaki Silvier, the founder and the former executive director of the Institute for Security Studies and currently the chair of the ISS Board of Trustees. Dr. Silvier has been the driving force in advancing futures and evidence-based policy across Africa. His book, Africa First, The Future of Africa and Africa Tomorrow, have shaped thinking on governance, growth, and transformations. So Yaki, he joins us today from Berlin. We should be seeing him on the screen shortly, where he's actually, in fact, writing his newest book on Africa's future. And we look forward to that. So Yaki's presentation will delve into the Africa Futures 2043 report. That's also within your conference bags, where he's going to highlight how data and modeling informs potential development pathways. Please join me in welcoming Yaki Silvier.
Thank you very much, Alice. I hope everybody can hear me and see me. Fonte Akum, Executive Director of the Institute, Mrs. Nados Bekele-Thomas, and Alice, of course, thanks for all the hard work. I'm joining you from Berlin. I'm currently a Richard von Weizsäcker Research Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy, and to show I'm in Berlin, I put on an Appelmann t-shirt just to confirm this is where I am. Colleagues, my talk to you is about the first part of the conference, which is about insight. So I'm going to start sharing screen, and I'm showing you a chart, as I always do, as most of you knows. On the left-hand side is there are three columns on the chart. All the data in the chart is in 2017 constant dollars, and this column, 2023, is the size of the African economy in 2023. And the right-hand side are two additional columns for its size in 2043. The left-hand side shows that the African economy was about $2.6 trillion in size. And you can see at the bottom, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa. And then we say that on its current trajectory, what we refer to as the current path or the business as usual forecast, this is what the size of the African economy will be in 2043. 2043 is the end of the third 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. So 2023, 33, 43, 53, 63. Our forecasts are for 2043. And there it says that by 2043, on the current path, on the business as usual forecast, the African economy will be about 6.4 trillion US dollars. However, it could be $8.9 trillion US dollars in what we refer to as a combined scenario. The combined scenario, which I'm going to explain, is a high growth, ambitious forecast of what we think is possible for Africa by 2043. You can see the differences in the size of the various economies: Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, Ethiopia, Algeria, Kenya, Morocco, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, etc. So that is what we think is possible for Africa. And I'm now going to show you a chart that shows the same data on the left-hand side. This is exactly what I showed you. This is 1960, the size of the African economy. There is COVID. And that's the current path forecast, $6.4 trillion versus the ambition, what we think is possible after we modeled an ambitious scenario for every African country. And you can see this is an aggressive scenario. On the right-hand side is a growth rate forecast. Well, this up until 2023, 2024, it's data. And then you can see our growth forecast on the current path about 5.2%. And by 2043, and on the aggressive combined scenario, an average growth rate for all of Africa's 54 countries of 7.5%. So this is, in a sense, the size of the African economy and the associated growth rate on the current path or the business as usual forecast and the combined high growth forecast. The other indicator that we often use is the extent of extreme poverty in the continent. So in this chart, we are still using $2.15. Some of you may know that the World Bank recently changed their monetary poverty line to $3 for extreme poverty. On the left-hand side is millions of people. On the right-hand side is a percent of people. So on the current path, you can see that extreme poverty is still increasing in Africa. We are at the moment of about 490 million people living below $2.15. And that on the current path could come down to around 441 million people. A small reduction in absolute numbers. But in the combined high growth scenario, that could come down to about 242 million people, or if I want to look at percentages, it could come down to about 10, 11% versus about 19% on the current path. So this is what is possible. This is where we think, using the International Futures Forecasting Platform, where we think Africa would be in terms of extreme poverty by 2043 and where we are coming from. So for our forecasts, all our data is publicly available on our homepage. This is the front page of the African Futures website. The site was launched in June of 2022 by President Cyril Ramaphosa and by the CEO of Order NEPAD, Mrs. Nardos Bekele-Thomas, whom you saw a few minutes ago by video. And our work is done all in conjunction with Order NEPAD, and that's why their logo is incorporated on the site. I've already explained that we forecast out till 2043, which is the end of the third 10-year implementation plan. There's a lot on this website. I'm going to scroll down past our blogs and how to use the site to a chart that shows you what we do where. So the first thing you can do on this website is you can individually pick a country, let's say South Africa, and that will take you to the page on South Africa with about 60, 70, 80 pages of analysis and charts on South Africa, South Africa's economic situation, amongst others, and the forecast till 2043. That's one way of looking at the future of Africa, because we model every African country, and we do so in detail. Another way of looking at the continent, of course, is to look at its various regions, like North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Africa. And we are today launching our update of our report on Africa, Africa's future prospects till 2043. But you may also be interested to look at the potential of the various regional economic communities. You know that the African Union recognizes 8 regional economic communities. The Arab Maghreb Union, although it's largely dormant, SENSAD, which is also largely dormant, but COMESA is up and running and has been for many years. So is the East African Community. ECOWAS is struggling. As we know, after the coup, 3 countries have now left ECOWAS. ECAS, East Economic Community of Central Africa, IGAD, and SADC, where we are, of course, at the moment. So that's another way of looking at forecasts that we've done. Or you can look at Africa's income groups, which in actual fact is the most useful way to look at Africa's future. This map shows Africa's one a high-income country, which is the island of Seychelles. Then Africa's 8 upper middle-income countries like South Africa. Then Africa's 23 lower middle-income countries. Namibia was recently downgraded to lower middle-income country. Until June of this year, it was an upper middle-income country. Or you can look at Africa's 22 low-income countries like the DR Congo, Mozambique, and so on. So this is one set of work that we do. Another way to look at that is to go to geographies and to look at the drop-down and to click on any of them. Each of these countries or geographies takes several months to do. So there's more than 4,000 charts on this website and almost 1 million words of text. After we've done that, after we've looked at the geographies, we also do something else. I have already shown you the current path forecast, and we do this for every country. And I have shown you the results of our combined scenario or our high growth scenario by that, and we look at that till 2043. But in addition to that, we also look at the future of governance in Africa, and we model the impact of more security, more capacity and inclusion on the development outcomes of African countries. We look at demographics, fertility, contraception use, maternal. In each of these themes and with each of our scenarios, we try and benchmark what we think is aggressively possible for every country in an ambitious scenario. And that's how we benchmark. We look at the future of, or the potential of, an agricultural revolution, how that would change Africa. Africa has not had an agricultural revolution. We look at the impact of better health and better provision of water sanitation. We look at the impact of education, primary, secondary, tertiary, gender parity, quality, and we model all of that. And that, of course, education is hugely important, but slow moving. We look at the impact of a manufacturing transition. All countries that have rapidly grown have done that through a manufacturing transition. The story is that the manufacturing escalator goes up more rapidly than the services escalator. Then we model the impact of the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We also look at the impact of leapfrogging. What would leapfrogging do? Artificial intelligence, ICT, renewable energies, and so on, to Africa's future. We model the impact for every African country of aggressive increases in remittances, aid increases, maybe after a democratic transition in the US, foreign investment inflows, as well as a reduction in illicit financial outflows. And we look at the impact of large infrastructure on Africa's growth. Once we have those scenarios are then captured in what I showed you, the combined scenario. In addition to the combined scenario, and after we've done all of this, we look at the impact of climate change on Africa. We look at the impact of energy. Now, in each of these, you can click on it, and it'll take you to the theme. And in all of these pages, for example, if you would go down to the left, you would find a content menu pop up. And for example, there's also a section where you can look at chart. So this would be our forecast on, for example, or the forecast from the International Futures Forecasting Platform on energy production by type for the world and CO2 emission from 2000 till 2063. So this is the kind of work that we've done. Let me go back to the home page. So I was showing you an example of energy. You can also look at our forecasts, on Africa and the world, where we've looked at 4 different worlds, how those 4 different worlds will impact on Africa. And these different worlds is a sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. And some of you may have been on some of the seminars that we've presented all over the world on how that could unfold and the impact on Africa. We also model the impact of gender on Africa and the impact of work and jobs on Africa. So that's what we do on the site. And as I've said, there's more than 4,000 charts and a lot of data on this chart. We are today looking at the long-term future of Africa and launching our updated report on Africa. So I'm going to go to the Africa theme on the website. I'm going to scroll down, and on the left-hand side, a menu pops up. I'm going to go to charts. I'm going to do, as we always do, we very often start with population because it's so fundamental. So this is the population structure in the current path, or our business as usual forecast from 1990 till 2043. On the left-hand side is population structure in millions of Africans from 1990 with a forecast till 2043. And then on the right-hand side is the composition in percent, 1990, 2023, 2043. So you can immediately see how Africa's children, persons under 15, how rapidly that is increasing, as well as the increase in the size of its population between ages 15 and 29 and between 30 and 64. Now, these two cohorts, 15 to 29 and 30 to 64, are very important because they represent our potential labor force. And at a certain ratio, it translates into a demographic dividend. Unfortunately, many African countries only enter a potential window of opportunity in the second half of the century, which is a huge challenge for the continent. And we can speak about that. We can, for example, look at where Africa is headed in terms of its urban and rural population. So this is the percentage of people living in rural areas and the percent living in urban areas for the entire Africa. So Africa becomes largely urban in 2038. Of course, Africa differs. We can, for example, look at the region that is the most rural in the world, which is East Africa. East Africa only becomes urban in the second half of the century. And we can compare that with the region that is the most urbanized and also the most developed in Africa, which is North Africa. And you can see that North Africa became more urban already from around 2000. So these are different charts that are available on the site that shows you Africa and various dimensions of Africa. This is the size of the African economy from 1990 with a forecast until 2043. Again, we can see the impact of COVID. Africa only recovers from the impact of COVID by about 2029. And you can see the very rapid increase in the size of the African economy out till 2043, until it is over. This is on the current path. Remember, this is where we think things will go. This is without really addressing aggressive interventions. Guys, so if I were to then ask, what is that growth rate? This is Africa's growth rate. So this is Africa's growth rate out. This is history, percent increase in the size of the economy by 2043. And this is the forecast on growth rate out till 2043. Now, this is the average for Africa. Of course, it will differ. If we want to, for example, look at what would be the growth in the rest of the world, we can scroll down and say, what is the world except Africa? And you can see that the rest of the world is going to grow much more slowly than Africa. And the main reason why we are growing more rapidly is because of our rapidly growing population. But that, of course, is not an indication of more prosperity. It's just simply more people means a larger economy. So growth rates are, of course, differ. If we were, for example, to look at growth rates in low-income Africa, of course, we would expect that growth rates in low-income Africa with rapidly growing populations would be much higher than, for example, in upper-middle Africa. South Africa is one of Africa's 8 upper-middle income countries. Sorry, let me just go there. And you can see that, like many other, South Africa is struggling to grow. And this is our growth forecast for Africa's 8 upper-middle income countries. So these are some of the charts and forecasts that are available. We also, the forecasting platform includes the informal economy. So this is the size of the informal economy, which is one of the reasons why Africa struggles to grow rapidly. So on average, the informal economy as a percent of GDP is about 26%. The percent of the labor force that is in the informal economy was almost 60%. And you can see that this changes very slowly. And we can look at this for every individual African country. There's been a lot of debate about the informal economy in South Africa. Unfortunately, very little of that is really informed by data. So let us combine these two together and look at GDP per capita. For that, I'll go to GDP per capita on the Africa chart. And there we can see from 1990, with a forecast till 2043, how GDP per capita in Africa was declining and then started to increase until we had the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We had COVID, and then we see the forecast. Now that looks very impressive, but if we were then to add GDP per capita in the rest of the world except Africa, the situation looks quite different. We can see the growing gap between Africa and the rest of the world. And this really is the challenge. So we then modeled GDP per capita for in a high growth scenario. I know I need to wrap up. And this is what I showed you previously. When I showed you, this is our forecast for Africa's current path GDP per capita. And this is the impact then of each of those sectoral scenarios that we have modeled: financial flows, education, continental free trade area, which you will see as the largest impact, agriculture, large infrastructure leapfrogging, manufacturing, governance, demographics. And there is an additional impact that you get. So this is the work we do for every African country and for every region. And like with every of our charts, it concludes with a set of recommendations on deepening regional integration, because the continental free trade area has the most impact, governance and institutional reforms, the importance of human capital development, importance of Africa industrializing, harnessing financial flows, accelerating our green energy transition, although Africa will remain largely dependent upon fossil fuels, and poverty and inequality recommendations. Colleagues, I'm going to stop there. I have not spoken about how we do these forecasts. We use a forecasting platform known as the International Futures, and you can see all about International Futures on the technical part of the website. Tomorrow at, I think, 14:30, Ms. Taylor Hanna from the Pardee Institute for International Futures will be giving a workshop on the International Futures forecasting platform. So I've given you a lot of data, I've thrown a lot of charts at you, but I've tried to give you a flavor of the kind of work that we do on the African Futures and Innovation Platform. And I want to conclude just by saying my thanks to Alize and the other members of the African Futures team who've been holding the fort while I've been cycling around in Berlin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yapi. We're now going to move to our next keynote, which is going to be from insight to imagination. So we are joined by two visionary thinkers from Kenya, Dr. Stephen Lifty in the room here, the Director of Frontline Futures, and Ms. Wanchiku Wayopchi, Social Innovator and Youth Advocate. Dr. Lifty brings over 25 years of experience across 100 countries, combining foresight, evaluation, and systems thinking. He holds a PhD in African Studies from the University of Florida and serves as a board member of the Association for Professional Futurists and chair of a Participatory Futures Global Swarm. Ms. Wanchiku, online, joining us, brings the voice and vision of Africa's youth, a criminologist and advocate who has worked extensively with marginalized and at-risk young people. She leads a youth-led movement empowering young Africans to transform adversity into agency through storytelling, mental well-being, and collective action. Together, they will explore how story, culture, and healing drive Africa's transformation and how imagination is the bridge between today's challenges that you have clearly outlined and tomorrow's possibilities. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lifty.
Going to do a hybrid in the room, and Shiku joining from Nairobi. I hope you're here, Shiku.
Yes, hi.
Okay, great. And I will advance the slides as you wish. So I'm inspired somewhat by ISS's art and the color in their charts and so forth. And so I have found an artist that's going to capture this. So if we're going to do imagination, we're going to do a little art. I'm not going to dance. I'm not going to sing. We're going to have some artwork to show you some of the work of, it's actually Basil Kincaid. He's Ghanaian American. And you're going to see some of his work as we go through this. So our title here is Imagination Unlocked, as Elise said. And so I'll let you, gotten the title of Basil's work down there at the bottom. I think if people want the presentation, they can, but it's going to be recorded. You can grab your screenshots from there. So I'm just going to talk briefly here about neurocognitive realities. This is imagination locked. So this is the reality for a lot of people that are living in poverty, and foresight for them is 1 day, 1 week, 1 month. I've worked with youth and I said, what is your preferred scenario in 10 years? And they will say, I don't think I'll be alive in 10 years. So severely truncated. If you're coming out of Al-Shabaab, we work with a lot of youth in the coast of Kenya that have thought Al-Shabaab was their future. They join Al-Shabaab, find out it's not their preferred future, managed to get out. And we're working with these populations. Shiku's going to share a little bit more about that later. So I'm going to let you read some of the slides. I'm not going to read all of this, but trauma, we know neurobiologically that when we're asked to think about the future, we pull from the past. Makes sense. So crappy past, crappy future. That's the math that we have. And so when you're trapped in that you're no good, you have no future, you can't do anything, you have no future, that's what we're working with when we want to work with these populations. But neuroplasticity suggests that can change. And that can actually change relatively quickly within 12 weeks. I've worked in development 20 plus years. I have never seen the change in individuals, like literally seeing change from head down, whispering in focus groups. This is part of my research. I did it at Stellenbosch. My professor, Professor Rue, is here. To 12 weeks later, head up and voice projected. So in 12 weeks, seeing massive sort of changes in their disposition. So there's something here that's related to the coloniality and the epistemological violence that happens when imagination is shrunk and it's pushed back and it isn't unleashed. It's not unlocked. And so I'm actually going to let Shiku talk a little bit about the programming that we're doing. So Shiku, you have the floor.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. So yes, I work at an organization called the Greenstring Network, which is an NGO based in Nairobi. And on the screen, there should be a QR code. You can scan that to just learn more about us from our website. But what we are essentially is a social movement. We work with communities and community-based organizations to heal social and collective traumas through a variety of interventions, all centered around a three-pronged approach. So the first of this three-pronged approach, you can switch the slides, Steve. The first is that our movement fills an important gap between peace building, mental health, and development, drawing on evidence of what works in each of these fields to deliver a powerful, integrated, healing-centered approach with demonstrated impact. Being healing-centered, which is strength-based, is different from and more than just being trauma-informed, which is deficit-based. So it means we infuse trauma awareness, knowledge, and skills into cultures, practices, and policies, and then subsequently translate this knowledge to focus said cultures, practices, and policies on ways to heal from trauma. In practice, it means moving away from asking what is wrong with you or even what happened to you to ultimately a more affirming stance of who are you, what is right with you, and what is right with your community, all in while emphasizing a positive, strength-based approach that recognizes individuals, communities, organizations for their resilience and well-being. So what this approach does, it puts healing at the center of peace, well-being, and prosperity, and arguing that you can't talk about peace building, mental health, nor development without addressing the underlying traumas that lead to or prop up violence, ill health, and community stagnation or degeneration. And the healing-centered approach is premised on the idea that if we are to build lasting peace, well-being, and prosperity, we need to heal the individual and collective traumas that exist in communities at the root. Because without healing these underlying hurts, wounds fester and become chronic, violence becomes cyclical, and individual, community, and national development is stalled. Secondly, we operate within and build on the lower foundation of the WHO's service organizational model, which is the diagram you should be able to see on the screen. It's a pyramid framework that describes the optimal mix of services for mental health. Our movement focuses on both self and community care within a cultural context in what is known as community-initiated care. Much of what we deem mental health issues, as well as their consequent effects on individuals and communities, can be addressed effectively within this informal space. And so we see mental health as more than just mental health, it's holistic health that can and should be attended to first and foremost by and among people and communities, existing beyond the costly, pathologizing, highly individualized biomedical space and prioritizing community-driven and community-based solutions. So with KQ, we aim to maximize the use and effectiveness of these informal services and endeavor to enhance community solutions to issues of mental health. And by strengthening these community-initiated and community-based solutions, we're not only taking pressure off the important top part of the pyramid, to taking pressure off those important specialized services at the top of the pyramid and enabling them to better carry out what they intended to do, but also bringing healing back to people in a manner that is ultimately way more effective and sustainable. So this approach is not just about providing services, it's about empowering community to be their own first line of support, using solutions that emerge from their own wisdom and experience rather than waiting for external validation or intervention. And then lastly, we use storytelling and play. You can switch the slide. We use storytelling and play that feels natural to our communities, art and imagery that speaks to local experiences, and embodied practices drawn from our own traditions as our main method of delivering the curricula. Building on these and other cultural practices to remove these programs from a classroom setting, so to speak, into a more informal, culturally contextualized space. So this is because we recognize the transformative power of art and culture, specifically local art and culture, in promoting resilience and personal growth, particularly where this is pulled from existing traditions. As you've seen, Steve has already used some wonderful paintings from African artists, and I will be doing the same. It's very much present in everything we do. People heal best in the language they understand, and so we use these tools to help people articulate the traumas they have experienced and recognize how these experiences have shaped them, as well as cultivate knowledge and skills in a way that's innately familiar, comfortable, easy for all to understand, and impactful. So our movement is not about introducing foreign concepts, but using what is already deeply embedded in our cultural fabric to facilitate healing. By incorporating deeply culturally relevant and creative expression into our interventions, we provide participants of all backgrounds and level of education with an avenue to process their emotions, share their experiences, and connect with others in a supportive, collaborative, and familiar environment. It's returning to the wisdom our communities have always had in a very intentional way. In contrast to the dominant approaches to addressing mental health needs in Kenya, which are largely biomedical, individualized, non-contextualized, our approach is communal instead of individualized. It's contextual rather than generic, familiar rather than foreign, community-led versus expert-driven, community-based versus institutional-based, and non-pathologizing, healing-centered, and strength-based versus pathologizing, trauma-focused, and deficit-based. And crucially, what we are is an African solution to an African problem. The problem being foreign, largely Western models of care that we have adopted with little scrutiny of its application to our needs, expectations, realities, and practices. And so as GSN, we're moving away from this, instead creating approaches that truly reflect our community's needs, wisdom, and ways of healing. So what does all this actually achieve? Broadly speaking, our most recent results evidence that through our programs, young people are gaining improved trauma and mental health awareness, increased self-acceptance and therefore self-esteem, healthier coping mechanisms, improved emotional regulation, improved social connections and relational well-being, increased concern for others, and increased capacity to see long-term and big picture, which is the main element we're focusing on today in our talk. and which are components of futures consciousness, and then the support and skills to handle life's challenges now in perpetuity. So what that means is participants are recognizing stressful and/or traumatic experiences from their past or present. They're understanding how these manifest and what these do to them. They're practicing techniques to help them feel better, where these include both self and community. They're feeling more confident in their understanding and acceptance of themselves. And through this reconciliation of past trauma, gaining recognition of and consideration for theirs and their younger peers' future. And then in turn, all of this is influencing their attitudes of peace, trust, forgiveness, and reconciliation, all of which they're more likely to embody, lowering their levels of post-traumatic stress, increasing their general well-being, and setting them up for a better future. So if you move to the next slide, yeah. So these results generally play upon each other, and what we actually see is kind of a stepped path of transformation across two realms. In the first, in individuals, firstly at the cognitive level, we see improved awareness and understanding of trauma, where this translates to better emotional regulation and healthier coping practices. And then secondly, at a personal level, this led to increased overall well-being and decreased post-traumatic stress. And then third, participants were seen to develop stronger self-acceptance, self-esteem, and a sense of agency. They became more empowered and importantly developed futures consciousness, the ability to see and plan beyond immediate challenges to longer-term possibilities. Regarding futures consciousness, we found that participants dramatically increased in all 5 dimensions. That's agency, beliefs, time perspective, systems perception, care for others, and openness to alternatives. And the most significant improvements were that our program participants demonstrated increased care and well-meaning intentions towards others. They gained a deeper appreciation for and assumed stewardship over future generations, as well as a deeper appreciation for intentional consideration of an increased confidence in their own personal futures. And this improvement in their attitudes towards their personal futures is particularly striking, considering the context of their communities, where hustle culture and economic strife has people, youth especially, stuck in the here and now and accustomed to short-term thinking, to quick and often impermanent respite. If you could just go to the previous slide, Steve, let me finish up with the community sphere. Yeah, there you go. So in the community sphere, then we also see improved awareness and understanding, better emotional regulation and healthier coping practices. And then secondly, this leads to improved social awareness and relational well-being and stronger community engagement. And then in turn, this leads to broader attitudes of peace, trust, and forgiveness and reconciliation among community members. So these results create a ripple effect of healing, resulting in both thriving people and thriving communities. And now you can change the slide. Yeah. So to highlight a few examples, we found that beneficiaries felt affirmed and empowered in themselves, such as one participant who said they felt worthy, another that learned that they were never broken, and another who testified they now have self-drive and hope in anything that happens to them. Another prominent line of transformation shown in testimony was around social connection and reintegration, such as one participant who told us that they, quote, used to be a lonely person and not greet anyone, but now they greet a lot of people and have friends, unquote. And another who remarked that they, quote, used to suffer so much pain from conflicts, but now they reach out to the people concerned and reconcile, and their heart remains lighter, unquote. But far and away, some of the most powerful stories we had from our beneficiaries were those of how they learned to reconceptualize the past, reframe the present, re-engage in it, and reauthor their futures. The program's journey allowed participants to reconcile their past trauma and come to terms with the painful memories that had influenced their present attitudes and actions. And this process in particular enabled them to more actively engage with thinking about the future, particularly from an optimistic point of view. In the process of unlocking and reconciling with their past trauma, participants conveyed the idea that their brain was quote unquote unshackled, and a mental prison, another direct quote, that they found themselves in was unlocked. This is exemplified by a participant who stated that they were now able to, quote, see how the issues that community is facing are caused by trauma and how they can help them, unquote. And another who came to understand that trauma is normal in life, and when you learn to manage it, no problem will bring you down. We have had participants go on to start businesses, others who have gone on to complete their education, which they had dropped out of, some who have left or stopped joining gangs. The sentiment that is perhaps most powerfully put, however, by one participant who stated that attending Kumekucha was a rebirth, a relaunch of their life. This same participant then went on to proclaim, quote, "I want others to have what I now have. I want them to experience the life change that I am privileged to have experienced. I want them to have the hope, faith, drive, and sense of purpose I now possess. I want them to be as free as I now am," unquote. And yeah, that is the work that we have been doing at GSN and all the brilliant things it can lead to and has led to.
Thank you, Shiku. So what I'm going to do is transition to an imaginative justice unleashed. So we talk about cognitive justice. This is looking at the multiple knowledges that deserve equal standing. Imaginative justice is taking that maybe one step further and saying everyone deserves the conditions to imagine and try alternatives. So this is valuing the neurosocial constraints, or healing the neurosocial constraints, valuing languages and rituals, and extending healing to state actors. Kumekucha, Greenstring, we worked with the National Police Service in Kenya, one of the most traumatized entities, in Kenya, working with reconciliation among the police. When healing sticks, imagination moves from a canvas to systems. So there's micro, Wanjiko was sharing a little bit about the micro. We're seeing within the communities we're working with that's moving into the meso, the community and service level, but also ideally working into the macro, into the policy and markets sort of space where the government and security sectors can be adopting this. And like I said, this is recorded, so you can grab comments there. I'm not going to read through all of that. Want to keep this in our time frame. So something that, an imaginative sort of approach would maybe call for an African about face. And so when we look at linear growth models, which is modeled there on the top, the three that are always at the bottom, Niger, Central African Republic, and Chad, top three, generally Switzerland, Ireland, and Norway. What I'm suggesting is what happens if you do about face here, and some of the most cutting edge work coming out of Northern European countries, donut economics, regenerative economics, I think are closer to a lot of what indigenous African systems have communicated for centuries. Kate Rawa's donut economics, regenerative economics, to me, this is very much embedded in African sort of systems. This is a whole lot faster to get from here to here than to always be following Western sort of models that are built on linear sort of models. And so, yeah, this is just an imaginative way of thinking about how you could possibly think about what does it mean to engage with African indigenous knowledge systems and aiming for these green, sustainable, restorative, regenerative sort of cultures. Instead of working all the way around following the laggards, Africa can actually be at the forefront and leading into the future. Here's just a little bit of a breakdown of what imaginative constraints are and unshackled imagination outcomes, and then the mechanisms that are there for what I have: governance, economics, historical identity, and the physical symbolic sort of space. So again, I'll let you kind of come back to this to look at how, when you unpack this, it's more than just art. It's more than just Basil's artistic creations. So here's just me kind of thinking where we could go with that. And this is not just me. I'm going to use the quotes of four other individuals to suggest that this is something that is embedded deep in the ethos on the continent. Wangari Maathai said, "Nobody knows the solution to every problem rather than blindly following the prescription of others. Africans need to think and act for themselves and learn from their mistakes." Adrienne Marie Brown talks about imagining new worlds. And this is a collaborative ideation. What are the ideas that will liberate all of us? She's asking. Vito in 78 said the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. What happens when that mind is unshackled? They lose control and the oppressed are set free. And I still think there are certain models that dominate the system. And so what we're finding with Kumakuchi Quest is that these models can be unleashed, and the mind can be unleashed. And then finally, Sankara's quote that many of you are familiar with, we must dare to invent the future. I think this is something that we can honor his legacy with, to invent that future. And so I'll just wrap up with this last slide, which is our finding our information, reading the report. And a special thanks to Basil Kincaid and his team in Ghana and the US. This is actually not art, these are quilts. This is used fabric. It's Ghana kente cloth that he is weaving into these 10-meter wide by 5-meter quilts that he's hanging on the wall to capture a story. And so special thanks to him and his team for letting us use his work in his presentation. So I will end there.
Thank you, Stephen and Wanfutu. I also want to turn your attention to a little book in your conference bag. And for our online audience, this is on the Africa Futures website that captures very imaginative stories of our top 5 young change makers that has joined us in Korea. And they envision Africa in 2025, which is really inspirational. And we will delve into that tomorrow when Bronwyn facilitates that session. So now for our final keynote that focuses on action. So how foresight moves from vision to implementation. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Olubengu Adesida, the co-founder of Funafu, and Muska, the leader of the Africa Innovation Summit and a longtime champion of foresight and innovation continent. Dr. Adesida has advised governments, development partners, and private sector leaders across Africa, helping translate thinking into policy and practice. He will speak on using foresight in Africa decision-making landscape to reflect on how tools of futures work can drive more resilience and forward-thinking governance. Please welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Alice, for that. I think you may have oversold my presentation, but let's see how we proceed. My name is Olubengu Adesida, as Alice said. Greetings. It's good to be here this afternoon, to be among you all here. People who are concerned and people who future of the continent, and to some extent the future of the world. These are perilous times for the world. And it's important that we think seriously about where we are going.
Speak close to the microphone.
Sorry.
Just lifting it.
Yeah. It's important for us to think about where we are going as humanity and where we are going as a continent.
Yeah.
Even where we are, given the challenges that we are facing on the continent, and what we need to begin to do to change the story of our continent for the longer term. My reflection, yes. Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
This mic's on. It's mic on.
Hello. Hello, good afternoon.
No, with that, the online audience
okay.
can capture you. We'll sort it out.
Well, greetings, good afternoon. Again. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and those joining us online, in person here in the room, good afternoon again. Thank you. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the ISS team for inviting me here today to be part of this meeting and this conference and this discussion. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to reconnect with old friends and the community that has long been dedicated to looking at the future, exploring what the future has for us, and what we need to do to make things different. I promise not to bore you by tricky fire. Hello. Hello. Can you hear better? I promise not to bore you by preaching to the choir. Most of you here are concerned about the future already. because most of us here already recognize why this conversation matters. Why does it matter for us to think about the longer term? We are gathered here as a people who have dedicated time and energy for advancing foresight, and in the French tradition, la perspective. Okay? What I hope to do today is to share my story. I'm not going to give you the history of foresight or what, but I'm going to talk to you about the experience that I had in the early 90s, or the late 90s, trying to drive foresight on the continent as part of a team that was set up by the UNDP in the 1990s. So my story, I call myself accidental foresight practitioner because in the early 90s, I was in the US doing a PhD program in economics. When I was looking for, hello, yes, this is right. In the early 90s, I was in the US doing a PhD program, and I was looking for a part-time job where I can actually collect data for my PhD thesis in economics. And that led to getting a job at the UN that I was not looking for. But when I got the job, I was quite excited because it became part of a small team that was just being set up by the UNDP, where African countries to think long term. This is in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union had just fallen. The rage on the continent was structural adjustment programs. We adjust or not adjust. How do we transform our economies? How do we industrialize? And so we had a small team in Abidjan to begin to reflect and to engage African countries on long-term planning on the continent. It was a time when the global discussion was about how planning has died, and planning is supposedly dead. And we have been put together to help African countries to think about planning long-term. So how do we do? What do we do to get this to happen on the continent? So when we started our process, we began quickly to begin to realize that it's not just a job we've been given. It's an awakening. We begin to think that we can actually be audacious. We can ask different questions, and we can begin to engage people within the continent and outside that are thinking longer term. And so we, in the process of us reflecting and trying to decide how do we proceed, how do we help African countries, how do we engage, we realized that we need to use foresight, not the traditional planning tools anymore, but foresight. And the thing that we also tried to put on top of that was, how do we do foresight by the people for the people? And for those of you maybe old enough at that time, we went around African countries, setting up national teams, organizing workshops from villages to cities to get Africans to think and reflect collectively about the long term of their countries, to develop scenarios and propose recommendations for their governments and their society on how to transform their economies, how to transform their societies. We did this, we were doing this. To some extent, I wish I could say there was a collective joy that we are doing this. They were resistant. And at the heart of our approach was a conviction that foresight could and should be democratized. How do we get people to participate in this process of thinking about the future as a connect? It was not to remain the realm of consultants or experts, even local ones at that. And the idea we had was, how do we ensure that it's a participatory process brought together and bring together the governors, those who are making decisions on our behalf, and those who are being governed, plus the experts, see how we think, how we design, how we redesign our societies for these challenges that we have to face in those days. And the message that we began to spread was that our process may not change your country, but the process is as important as the output. That is, the focus should not be publishing polished scenarios alone, but how do we engage people? How do we empower them? How do we inspire them to begin to think about that? Not just at the decision level making, but at the society, in the private sector. And how do we begin to organize as a collective so we can build collective actions for transformation, and we collaborate across sectors. And so we began in the early days organizing training workshops, publishing methodological guides. We even began a bulletin of African Futures bulletin. Those days, we were publishing quarterly from our offices in Abidjan. And set up teams, about 20 African countries over time, the life of the project. And most of those visions, those days of Vision 2020, or in Cote d'Ivoire, Vision 2025, La Prospective, Agenda 2025 in Cote d'Ivoire. And then I look back now, this is where in the 90s, 2025 was like that long time before. So how time fly. Ladies and gentlemen, as we began to design this process, we realized that we're not first. There were others before us. When you look back, look at the Morovia group of experts in the early 70s that began to think about the future of the continent. If you look back again, under Adedeji, the ECA, the UN ECA, was beginning to think about alternative approaches to development in Africa. That led that was signed by African head of states in Lagos in 1980, where they defined an agenda for the future of the continent, which to some extent were never really fully implemented. But that agenda was derailed internally and externally in terms of, because African countries made the decision that we have to industrialize and we have to change our continent. But they did not have the wherewithal, the courage to drive that through. And so they were easily derailed. Again, as we began designing the process, walking the path of that others have charted before us, we realized that there's a lot has to be done on the continent. And the interesting stuff is that many were skeptical, and they are still skeptical today, whether Africans can lead their own transformation. Some in those days pushed UNDP, our main financier, say, let these guys just stay in one country. Let them do this exercise there and show results first before they can move to the next country. Some, no, the process of going around the country, engaging poor people, engaging the locals to think about their future was too cumbersome. Let's hire experts to get this done. We found a way to push back. We had our ground as much as possible because we believe that foresight had to be authentic and has to be locally owned, not outsourced or sanitized. In the end, we pressed on launching national foresight exercises within governments, civil society, and industry in actually many countries on the continent. Some could not finish because it touched on too many sensitive issues. Okay. In some countries, the government was afraid of negative scenarios. Just wanted to be published the optimistic scenarios. I remember in one country, I got back to Abidjan, I was called by the UNDP president that I have to come back because the government wanted to rewrite scenarios. It only focus on the positive. And so, try to advise how to push, but the government sat on their own, rewrote the documents to go and present to Parliament. And the story thereafter in many of these countries did not really work out well. I wish I could say before you that our work led to transformation on the continent. It did not. That's the reality of the fact. But we did have some meaningful wins from the continent. We helped government to launch long-term planning processes. And some of these are beginning to take root on the continent today. We trained this in the 20 countries that were involved in the hundreds of people on foresight. And by organizing workshops in rural areas, in the cities, with different sectors, I'm sure we touched thousands of people. I still remember workshops that we did in Mutare, in Zimbabwe, the one that we did in Jinja, in Uganda, or the one that we did in Blantyre, in Malawi, engaging civil society activists, academics, and policymakers on the need for change. We planted foresight sees on the continent to a large extent. Sadly, though, many of the worst case scenarios that we've not predicted, that we foresaw, is what happened or what is playing out to some extent till today in many of our countries. I don't want to name them here, but in many of our countries, many of those negative scenarios were foreseen. Okay? And so when I think back on these years of being involved in foresight on the continent and outside of the continent, working with governments and international agencies, and when at least I'm going to speak about my experience and lessons from that experience, I draw 6 key lessons. First, implementation plan. Too often, most of our plans are simply visionary plans. They are visions. And they remain just that. Visions. And partly because of weak coordination, limited capacity. Even when we have capacity inside the countries, we don't bring our best people to come and take things forward. Because of politics, sometimes because of ethnicity, but because of those who are in favor, not in favor, in the right party or not in the right party. So we don't put our best foot forward to drive this change in our countries. And also sometimes define a good agenda, long-term vision on the table, government democracy, government changes, the next government says, from the past government. Even when the same political party retains power and a new group comes in within that same party, sometimes they throw it aside because it's the others that did it. And so the lesson here is that foresight must move from periodic exercises to habit of governance. What my good friend is writing a book about anticipatory governance, in which we embed foresight in everything we do, states and societies, public administrations, and embed it even in our budgets so that we begin to finance these activities on an ongoing basis and not simply waiting for donors that when they have interest, they fund this specific product and they move on. And embedding it in our accountability systems and our public dialogue, and engaging society, engaging the population. Second, direct engagement of leaders. For too long, our leaders seem to stand aloof. The work is done and presented to them, they receive it, they put it on their table. More and more, I think it is crucial that our leaders be part of this process of thinking. They must be part of the process, not just recipients of outputs, but co-creators of these outputs, in a way that they can personally engage with the scenarios themselves, where they can also challenge their own assumptions about their country, their organization, their future, and internalize what the future could demand from them and from the society. Third, empathy among practitioners. Those of us who practice foresight, who give advice. We need to have empathy for those who are in position of power. But sometimes they want to change. But the context in which they are in simply makes it difficult for them to make those bold decisions to make change happen. So we have to understand where they are and where they operate. Understand the pressures which they are under. And this inertia that may surround them. And by showing that empathy, by working with them, we can create trust that allows them to slowly join or to buy into what we are trying to push or what we're trying to sell to, which is thinking long term, making decisions based on strategic thinking rather than immediate political needs. And fourth, restoring agency. Foresight's greatest promise lies in its restoring a sense of agency to citizens, officials, and communities alike. Every participant should live a foresight exercise with a conviction that they can influence what happens next. We have to become part of it. And if you do foresight well, and people are engaged in that process, it becomes very important that when you finish, the reflection, the visioning process, that everyone in that process feel that they have the capacity to bring about change. That if I link with my next door neighbor if I link with my other people, we can collaborate and bring about collective actions to drive change in our country. Fifth, we must build a community, building a common language. Foresight is about this, building a common language among the people, with the policymakers, with the leadership, that because when foresight is kept only among the elites, those of us in this room, the elites in the room, it slowly dies. Okay, it dies quietly. So its vocabulary insights must reach journalists, school system, private sector, and ordinary citizens alike. So we can understand what the future requires of us as a population and as a society. Last but not least, the courage to break free. Talk about courage in your presentation. Perhaps the hardest lessons of all is from 9 years of engaging in this process, that we must liberate ourselves from others referred to as the tyranny of the public, tyranny of what is possible, rather than letting ourselves to imagine, to have the courage to imagine a different future. This tyranny of the probable, the comfort of linear projections and safe assumptions. Real foresight demands courage to imagine beyond convention, to experiment, and to embrace uncertainty as a space for innovation. And if you let me, give me 1 more minute to conclude, I want to just raise 5 points. Africa's transformation will not come from imitation or dependence. The music of development has changed, so must our dance must change. We cannot be dancing to the tune that's no longer there. Second, foresight is not foreign or technocratic input. If Gershi was here and others were here, and my good friend here, they can talk about the history of foresight, the African traditional societies, the indigenous societies. Foresight has only been present. And when you move to the modern era, foresight was always there, even at the independence time. And African leaders like Nkrumah Nkrumah thinking about how do we build a better future for our continent, for the countries. Okay, so foresight has always been there. And thirdly, the lesson from decades of effort is clear. Our continent can no longer depend on inherited models or imported assumptions. Africa's futures must be authored by African minds and shaped by African institutions that dare to imagine differently. You have to be able to imagine differently, to be able to bring things to life. So let us democratize foresight. Let's strip away the jargons, strip away the necessary tools that make it difficult for people to want to participate, or to want to enter the space. Let it become not an occasional event, but the heartbeat of how we govern, how we plan, and how we learn, and how we live in our continent. The future is not something that happens to us. It does not happen to us. It's something that we can shape. And we have no option to shape it together if we are going to survive and if we are going to try in the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavender. I'm now going to move us to the final part of our program today. So I'm going to invite Ms. Michelle van Rooyen to please come sit here in front. She's one of our researchers, but also a foresight practitioner herself. And together with Michelle, Prof. Andre, Dr. Marvelous, and Dr. Njeri, I'm going to ask you to join her as we move into the last segment of our conversation. I'm going to ask for the 2 mics to be given to them as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Elise, for the introduction. And thanks again for our keynote speakers who set the scene, I think, so powerfully. They've taken us through the 3 pillars that shaped our conference this year. We started with insight, where Jako's presentation showed us how evidence and modeling can ground us in credible foresight. We then moved into imagination to remind us that insight alone doesn't drive change. We also need stories and creativity as engines of transformation. And then finally, bringing it back to action, because no matter the method or approach, ultimately, the goal of foresight is to influence decision-making and to shape better outcomes. So it's my privilege today, then, to welcome you now to this Foresight Dialogue, where we'll be building on these insights and themes that the keynote speakers covered, and to engage in a cross-disciplinary exchange on how African-led approaches can embed futures thinking into policy, planning, and public discourse. I'm joined today by 3 African foresight experts. And not only am I honored to be moderating the session with them, I've also been very fortunate to work and learn from each of them. Now, I know all of you, but let me just check my notes for the bios so that I don't get any angry calls after this session. We've got Prof. Andre Roux, who is an associate professor and principal lecturer in economics at the Stellenbosch Business School, where he also heads the Futures program. Former director of the Institute for Futures Research, he has helped advance futures thinking in South Africa and across the continent. Prof. Roux has worked with over 100 private sector and government clients and delivered over 300 scenario planning engagements globally. We've got Dr. Njeri Mwagiru, a senior researcher for futures and systemic innovation at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Her work applies foresight and participatory approaches to strengthen institutional capability and systemic change. Njeri's interdisciplinary background spans education, psychology, development, and governance. She's a member of the Association of Professional Futurists, as well as the World Future Studies Federation. We've got Dr. Marvelous Ngundu, my colleague, at the African Futures and Innovation Program here at the ISS. He holds a PhD in economics, and he is the recipient of the 2024 Megatrends Africa Research Fellowship at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in Germany, as well as a fellowship program for the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for today. All right, I think I'd like to start with Prof. Roux. You've spent decades shaping foresight education and mentoring practitioners around the and mentoring practitioners across the continent. So you've seen the field evolve in many different ways. So in your long view, how would you describe what foresight today actually looks like in African institutions? What are we getting right, but also where are we falling short?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I think I've been involved for about 30 years, my institute for over 50 years, sometimes in difficult times in the country's past, made life interesting. But I think to answer your question almost generically, I think some of the biggest challenge which I like to think we've overcome have been things like trying to deal with the attitude among so many people that the future is predetermined, preordained, and or imposed upon us, as the point's been made repeatedly by other powers. I often call this the que sera, sera approach. People say what will be, will be. We know things are changing, for better or for worse, can't do a thing about it. If and when that change does happen, then and only then we think about it. So very fatalistic. Then you get that school of thought that says, well, so many unknowns, why bother? Or another one which says, because we like to say very categorically, we cannot predict the future. Again, people might say, well, why bother then? What's this all about? We have what I call the NIMBY approach, not in my backyard. Organizations, people, entities that say, I've been around forever and ever, I'm big and strong and powerful, don't need to bother about change. We'll think all of you, but not me. I'm immune to it. We get the view that people say there's only one future, or just look at the past to predict the future. That's kind of the assumption that the future is a linear process, that it's almost a binary process. Then others say, well, wait a minute, there's so many crises. There's no way we can try to make some sense out of that. But I think the most important challenge has been, and still is, I believe, that human beings perceive the future as an extension of the current. Now, that's already problematic because the future is not linear. But secondly, even their perception of the current situation, the current worldview, is often not quite right. I think increasingly I'm getting the sense that, with perhaps partly due to social media, there's such a hyperbole, such a big, so many reports, fake news, call it whatever you like. We don't understand the present, to be perfectly frank. So we're basing our view of the future on an only half correct understanding of the present. Our world perceptions of the now really are, I think, skewed, tainted by propaganda, tainted by fake news, call it what you like. So I think we are missing very often that more holistic, that more nuanced and balanced view of what's going on right now. I'll stop talking now. It's from a quote, not quite Mark Twain, kind of Mark Twain, with apology to him. He disappeared many, many years ago. But he once said something along the following lines, which that's updated for the 21st century. And that is, if you are not on social media, you'll be uninformed. If you are on social media, you'll be misinformed. Let's find that balance, I think. That's an important part. I've got more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Prof. Rook. And Jerry, your work focuses a lot on building foresight within institutions. So building on Prof. Rook's comments at the end around cutting through the noise, how would you say in your work, and what have you seen is successful ways to truly embed foresight and cut through the noise, and also moving away from a one-off foresight exercise, but really building that culture that then extends towards sustainable foresight?
Thanks, Michelle, for the question. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here on this panel with Prof. Rook, one of the gurus that has informed my career. And also thanks to the ISS for putting together this really important convening. My response is embedded in your question. So I think one of the key successes for foresight to take hold in organizations or through initiatives that we engage in is to ensure that it's very practical. And thank you so much to Prof. Adesida for emphasizing that we have to democratize foresight and make it accessible to people that may not be familiar with the kind of thinking or the tools and methods that we use frequently in the field and in the practice. So ensuring that we are locating the foresight intervention within processes and practices already within the organization, whether that be strategic planning or budgeting processes, or in perhaps even in HR, learning and development, but ensuring we're embedded in processes that are already ongoing, institutionalized, have structures, budget lines associated is a really good way to embedding the foresight and ensuring that the insights you generate can get carried forward. And then in terms of buy-in, it's very important that we are participatory in our approach so that right from the get-go, from the co-creation of the intervention, you're involving the leadership, the key decision makers, but also the actors that you hope will be on board for implementing the suggestions and recommendations that will come out of the foresight. And we find that when foresight fails is when it's seen as a nice to have, as a kind of a side intervention, creative, fun, interesting to think about, but not really related to our daily grind, not really associated with our roles and responsibilities, and not linked to tasks that we have to deliver on. So when foresight is situated as an aside, as fun as it may be, then it tends to fade away into a memory of an exercise we did once with our colleagues. And I remember that scenario. It was very exciting, but nothing carried forward from there. So that's what I would say. To embed it, ensure that you're embedding it in organizational processes, structures. And I know that sounds easy. I'm sure in the conversation, we'll talk around some of the challenges in doing that as well.
Moving on to, from what Njeri said, Marvelous. She spoke mostly now around embedding that foresight capacity within African organizations. But in the work you do, and we do here at the ISS, and all of the modeling, like Yaki showed earlier, for each and every African country, going through all of the combined scenarios, I'm going to ask you to give a very broad question, but from all of the work and drawing on your experience, what would you say would be the one thing that African countries that are either holding them back currently from achieving the Africa we want, or putting it differently, what is the one thing that they should really focus on that would have the greatest long-term development impact?
Thanks, Michelle. So what we do most on our scenarios, we are more quantitative than qualitative. And I must emphasize that this is instrumental in reflecting the state of the transformative forms that are needed. So going back to your question, on the bottlenecks that are inhibiting Africa towards its journey to 2063. There are quite several of them, but I'll only touch on it. And all these challenges, they link back to the governance framework of the African countries. Without strong governance, we cannot mobilize domestic resources, cannot stop or curb illicit financial flows, cannot distribute resources to where they are needed. We cannot even attract foreign direct investment. We cannot be able to address the infrastructural gap that we are facing. So see that all the challenges that we are facing, they trace back to the issue of governance. Then the issue of infrastructural gap is one of the critical challenges that is inhibiting Africa's development potential. Meanwhile, Africa is investing something like 4% of its GDP towards infrastructure development, which is half of what South Asia is investing. South Asia is investing about 8.8 to 9% of its GDP towards infrastructure development. So this shows a gap, massive gap, when compared to the peer regions like South Asia. We have got bottlenecks, transport infrastructure. Our energy infrastructure is unreliable, which is inhibiting our manufacturing capacity on one end. Then we also have a problem of distorted economic transformation. In Africa, we have got two pillars or two sectors that are growing in parallel, but yet they are unproductive. You have got the growth of subsistence agriculture and also the growth of low and or low value services without any rejuvenation in the manufacturing sector. So there is no job creation at the potential that is expected. And what we found is that quite a number of people are trapped into poverty because of lack of employment. That is a major challenge. That is actually challenging most of the African countries towards achieving their development agenda. Then, of course, the other thing is the capital constraint. We don't have sufficient capital to address the challenges that we're facing, the infrastructure challenge that I've just indicated. We don't have capital to that. But I'll go back and say, for us to mobilize capital, for us to mobilize domestic resources that are needed, it traces back to the issue of governance. So our challenges are many, but they can be resolved. Like Yaki showed on our combined scenario, what we see is that if governance reforms can be addressed across African countries, the governance scenario in its own has got a power to push quite a number of development outcomes, including poverty alleviation, GDP per capita, and even the size of the African economy. The other thing is also the full implementation of the Free Trade Initiative, abbreviated as AFTA. This is one of the game changers that Africa should embrace. Our modeling aligns with the focus that was recently done by the World Bank. By 2035, if this initiative is fully implemented, the results are transformative, with over 30 million of the Africans lifted out of extreme poverty. And for the first time, Africa's exports will be over 1 trillion. So it means the Free Trade Initiative has got capacity to increase Africa's exports by over 500 billion. It is not only transformative in trade or in poverty, but it's also inclusive, increasing the wages for women who are mostly involved in small-scale trading, informal trading, and etc. So that's one thing that perhaps the African countries, African governments should embrace as a game changer towards development and growth.
Thanks, marvelous. And I see Prof. Ru is excited to say something. Just to transition from that, I think 3 things that stood out that are important and that I'm looking forward to get your opinion on, Prof. Ru, is that we have challenges and high levels of complexity, and we do need political and leadership methods. So I'd love to hear your response and to draw on how foresight and the work that you've done is really a way in where we don't, sometimes we're in rooms where leadership might view it as being too speculative or even politically risky, or listing all of the challenges that we have. So how do we really then, through foresight work and through your experience, overcome that to really get the value of foresight in driving transformative change for Africa?
Yes, thank you. I think there can be no doubt that governance is important, institutions matter a lot. But at the same time, future studies, foresight it's a team sport. I think to expect governments all by themselves to affect all these changes would be not only unfair, but perhaps not even appropriate. What I mean by that is that for these kind of things to work, and previous speakers mentioned this, the story needs to be told and sold to all corners of the kingdom, as it were. I think one of the biggest problems we have also at an institutional level, a corporate level, is a group of people, august, illustrious people, gather behind closed doors for a while, for a few days, for a few months, and they emerge triumphantly with a set of scenarios. Say, here we are, here's our future, make it happen. Those who are supposed to make it happen were not privy to what happened there. So I think, if we go back to, in this country, pre-94, there were three major scenario exercises. Well, maybe a few others, but the old mutual net course exercise, the Clem Center, high road, low road, and the Montclair scenarios. And they went a long way towards calming people down who were a bit nervous about pending changes. And they were successful because they went on a roadshow, as it were. In those days, videos were made and books were written and pamphlets were written, etc. I think today, if you were to ask most people in this country, tell us a bit more about the National Development Plan or Vision 2030, they'll probably say the what, why, when. So I think part of the story must be telling and selling the story to so many people. Then just perhaps another comment, if I may. You mentioned, I think your own words there, marvelous, were more quantitative, which is fine. Of course, we need to also try to get to grips with the aesthetic side of the future, the moral side almost, which is where scenarios are very useful, building that into it. Good futures work consists of two major components. You're getting good at that. Effective futures, doing the right things, the right tools, and the right way for the right reason. But then there's the word affect, starting with an A. I think we still have a lot of work to do there in terms of really addressing people's minds and hearts and granting them, or I suppose empowering them with that agency, with that empowerment, so they make a difference. And it becomes part and parcel of their daily intercourse with human beings and other human beings, thinking about the future. I'll make one more comment. I suppose one of the biggest problems is, of course, I think someone mentioned it earlier, for so many people in this continent, the future is surviving the next few days, having a meal, having a plate of food on their tables in the next few days. So sadly for them, the time context is different than many other people. I'll summarize by saying that I think all of us in this room and many others, we're preaching to the converted. For millions and millions of people, this is brand new, unknown stuff. These kind of reports that Jackie just analyzed on the website, and there's beautiful stuff. It would be wonderful if every single person I won't say this planet, well, on this continent, were to read that and go through it and see how powerful it is. Okay, I'll stop talking there.
Thanks, Prof. Adding to what you just said about preaching to the converted, I think that's a very powerful statement. But Jerry, I'm going to pose to you then, thinking about the other side of the argument and maybe just some practical insight for practitioners and researchers and analysts here today and policy makers and decision makers. When there is institutional resistance, whether it's institutional, from leadership, even if it's participatory groups, as Prof. Rua said, what foresight is really about, you often have people from different backgrounds, competing priorities, different views of the future and different preferred futures. How do you, and especially in the work that you've been doing with participatory foresight and systems change. What advice do you have to overcome that and to really move from just a participatory exercise again to truly co-creating and taking that forward?
Yes, thanks for that. And fully in agreement with what Prof. Ru mentioned around the affective side of foresight. And perhaps I'll focus my response there. In foresight exercises, sometimes you're not just talking to the converted, you're speaking to the converted who, as you rightly note, Michelle, have got different views of the future, competing interests for the future. And especially if we speak about African futures, there are multiple claims to African futures for various reasons, our resources, our demographics, our deep history of humanity, right? So I want to build on what Prof. Adesida said in his comments. As foresight practitioners, it's also important to manage our own expectations of what we are expecting from our engagements. And one way to do this is to focus on the process. We're in it for the long game. So in terms of the outcomes of foresight, we are planting seeds of futures that we might not realize in our lifetimes, but you are definitely perhaps leaving a legacy, opening a door, beginning to carve out a pathway that future generations or those that come after us can take up towards realizing those concrete, tangible outcomes, be it systems transformation, institutional reform, global financial architecture renewal, et cetera, et cetera. But the process is very important. And I think if we focus on gains from the process of foresight interventions, this can be helpful. One, in overcoming conflicting, competing interests, because foresight allows for a space for these dialogues to happen in conducive ways, in ways that don't gridlock us in the past or gridlock us in the present, which, as Prof. Ru noted, can be very complex and murky. It allows us to shape a path forward together, not necessarily on consensus in the moment, but it definitely opens the pathways for consensus to be built, realized, and also creative tension can be very helpful for foresight processes. So my response in short, Michelle, would be manage our expectations on the final outcomes of the interventions we're doing. This could be long game. But if the process is robust, if the process has met the key cornerstones, if we ensure the seeds we're planting are well-nurtured in fertile soils, then I think you can count this as close to a successful foresight exercise as we can.
Thanks, Njeri. That makes me think of Marvelous. You recently published a blog, which I think is very fitting to today's theme, but also what Njeri has just covered around the different views and what that means and how to work through that. You wrote about how Africa is very good at their bold visions and blueprints. For example, the Africa we want, who's we and what do we want? And really the shortcomings then, and I think which fits into the action part as well, and the different approaches in what we're discussing in the foresight dialogue, whether quantitative or qualitative, but really then how do we bridge going forward, in your view, that gap from turning that bold visions, even within the foresight community, as Prof. Ru said, we can have very nice creative scenarios, but really how or what would your advice be to transform and bridge that gap between bold visions and action?
Thanks, Michelle. Prof. Ru indicated the NDP that people have long forgotten. So ambitious, but I don't think it reaped the results that we expected. That's lack of action. So we have so ambitious blueprints. Now the Agenda 2063. But that blueprint is just a mirror which shows us, which reflect our status quo and where we need to go. Action is lacking in Africa and its countries. And this is one of the things that perhaps African governments should take into account. So on the blog that you're referring to, Michelle, I took poverty is one of the critical challenge that Africa is facing. There is a widespread narrative that Africa is poor because of extreme poverty. Significant number of people still living less than $2.50 per day. But in the Agenda 2063, one of the aspirations is to eradicate extreme poverty by 2063. That's quite an ambitious goal. But what are we doing? What is the government doing to achieve that goal? That's the missing factor that we currently face. So why the motive towards poverty? In 1990, the poverty rate of Africa was better than the poverty rate of South Asia. 1990, about 4.5% of the Africans were living under extreme poverty compared to 50% in South Asia. Fast forward to 2023. South Asia reduced poverty down to 9%. From 50% to 9%, extreme poverty. Then Africa, only to 31%, from 45.5% to 31%. Comparing these two regions, there are some commonalities in terms of developing. But if one region can be able to reduce poverty in 3 decades by, say, 41%, and yet we are in the same time period, we are only able to reduce poverty by only 15%, 16%. So it means there is lack somewhere. There is some lack of commitment and some lack of action. Right, our work shows that by 2043, Africa's poverty under the current path will be around, extreme poverty, by the way, will be around 19% versus 2.5% for South Asia, 2040. So we're talking about 2 decades from now. We still see that there's still an element of slack. There's still some element of lack of commitment, lack of action, if we're comparing with our peer regions. So the question is, are we able to attain aspiration 1 of the Agenda 2063 by 2063? If we can make simple calculations on the current path, by 2063, we'll be having an extreme poverty rate of slightly over 10%. Means we can't. There's an action that is needed. And I agree with all the futurists that you've presented here, including my Prof. Roy and my colleague here, that there is lack of action. And Prof. Roy went further to say it's now an integration not only on the government part, but also on the general populace. Not to take Agenda 63 as a slogan only, but is something that needs transformative reforms and action. Thank you.
Thanks, Marvelous. I think, yeah, that's one of those things where slogans often offer a false sense of security in their vagueness and ambitions. And I think that's something that foresight, and just from working with my colleagues here, has really shown me, and the value of foresight is bringing people together, actually asking the right question. Who's Africa? What do we want? Breaking it down, and also challenging assumptions and our own biases and paradigms. So I think that's, from my view, really the value of foresight. And I think, as Prof. Ru, and I'd like to redirect this back to you, as Marvelous has said, a lot of lack of action, and there's this gap from government. But in your earlier comment where you said we have to stop almost just expecting governments to fix our problems. So maybe, and I'm sure from an educational perspective, and taking this further and embedding foresight within education, and really, I guess, going the full society ecosystem. But that's why I'd like to redirect this back to you. And what would be your answer then to start bridging this gap if we move away from the government aspect of it?
Okay, thank you. First of all, perhaps just to confirm what you're saying there, I might not get the words exactly right, but I remember someone once saying that ordinary South Africans are not impressed by grandiose ideas of world this and African that. They find refuge in the local. Reminds me of John Keynes, not hundreds of years ago, many decades ago. He tells a story. Imagine someone is chopping up vegetables in the kitchen, and they nick their finger and start bleeding profusely. And meanwhile, there's a radio report, no television those days, telling us that 1 million people in China just drowned in a massive tsunami. Keynes asked the question, what will bother you more, the little finger bleeding or the millions of people who have lost their lives? The answer is probably going to be your finger bleeding. So I think what I'm trying to say really is that we need to be pragmatic. We need to realize that amidst these grandiose ideas, which are often seen as wish lists, I think we need to commemorate and to rejoice in small triumphs. Much like Stephen was telling that, I think we call what you're doing, when I say small triumph, I don't mean it's unimportant, but I think it's an example of almost a micro level triumphs, and rejoice in them. We need to embrace, I can't say this enough, civil society, business leadership, business governance, civil leadership. We can't leave everything to governments, not because governments are necessarily bad, that's just not, can't just leave everything to governments. I also want to say that we need to try to, and we as everybody, try to convince each other there's no such thing as a quick fix. That's one of the most difficult challenges, I think, in Africa. We've been waiting for success, or waiting for some progress for decades, for millennia, well, hundreds of years, to say, well, just hang on another, 40 years? No, that's a real comfort to many people. So we need to be able to convince them there's no quick fix. I think Lionel Messi once said, the football player, it took me 17 years and 300 days to become an overnight success. At the same time, we need to, again, give people that hope that, one of my favorite sayings is so silly, really, but for some reason I find it very liberating. The future is the only space and time we can influence. God influence what happened in the past. Unfortunately, we are often swayed by the heaviness of the past. And again, I find so many people in Africa, up and down the length and breadth of Africa, speak to groups, seem to say, well, we can't do much about the future. We are victims of the past. That's not going to go away. What's the point in thinking about the future? I suppose my optimism lies in the well-known fact that half of Africa's population is younger than 20, but the youth population, I sense a degree of excitement, euphoria, enthusiasm. I think it's bubbling just below the surface, waiting to explode. wonderful ideas, wonderful thoughts about, well, business, but also about the future. And I say this at my own expense, being a pale, male, grey, whatever. I think young people in this continent, I think they are far more, I would say, realistically optimistic about the future than their parents and grandparents. I've forgotten the question, but that was the right one.
Thanks. I love that, realistically optimistic about the future. I think I would be able to sit here and talk with you guys for hours, but I think we should also maybe open the floor now to the audience. If there are any questions. Do we have any questions? If you could just raise your hands. Okay, great. Blessing. Okay, let's do a first round of these three and then I'll check in again. Please just, when you ask the question, please stand up and just introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and if you're addressing it to somebody specifically. And please also be mindful of the time and other questions we might have. So please don't take this opportunity for a keynote presentation.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kikana from the Health System Foundation. You know, nature will not allow many of our African presidents to see 2043, 2023. So, because they're old, currently they won't see, I mean, certainly not going to see 23 years, not going to see 2063. So the question is, how do we then, you know, encourage young people to believe in these visions? Because the people who are currently leading these, you know, wonderful plans are very old. So how do we then encourage young people to do this? Thank you.
Hi there, everyone. My name is Chanel van der Linde. I'm a senior researcher at the Helen Suzman Foundation. My question is just for the panel. Thank you very much on your foresights and insights as well. I think arguably we're living in the Anthropocene at the moment. So I'm curious, in your expert opinions, is there a trade-off between environmental friendliness or climate resilience and the ability for Africa to develop in the ways that have been forecasted in this lovely report? Thank you.
Thank you for today. I say very much insightful thing. And I am Fumio Shimizu. I am belonging to the Embassy of Japan in Pretoria. And there are many questions, but just one question is that so today it is about the future of Africa. And my impression is that there are many speakers talk about the future of Africa and or vision of Africa. But my understanding is that this idea of giving the future may be applicable for the post-conflict countries in Africa. But in reality, there are many regional countries where the conflict is going on. And your idea about the analysis for future. But what this kind of study could be applicable for the settlement of the conflict which is ongoing? So this is my question.
Thank you. Appropriate.
Okay, I'll give them a go. The first one was about, can't read my own writing here, real. Yeah, about the youth. how to make this realistic and tangible for the youth. I think again, and in reference to 2063, by then many of our leaders will be fond, well, maybe fond, certainly distant memories. That's part of the challenge. Part of the challenge is to develop this long-term way of thinking. I mean, if we think about China, for instance, their success for the last few decades didn't come overnight. I was there, I'm a guest lecturer sometimes there at a business school. I was told a couple of years ago, they're busy thinking about a vision 2080, 80. Maybe they're exaggerating for the visitor from South Africa, but we know they're long-term plans. Malaysia, the story is told in 1970, Malaysia was poorer than most countries in Africa. They put together their vision 2020, as they call it, a 50-year plan. Part of the nice part of the story is that everyone, like the earlier theme, was aware of this plan and knew what it was all about, acted accordingly. Whatever they wanted to achieve by 2020, they actually achieved by 1990. So only 20 years, but I stress the word only, it's still a long time. So it's part of what needs to be sort of inculcated in people, especially young people. Think long term. It's difficult. I think we could argue in many parts of the world, including this country, if you ask big business, what is your long-term view? They might say we have a 5-year strategy. And a government, our long-term is winning the next election. And ordinary consumers, our long-term is the next paycheck. So it is difficult, but we need to think about it. Someone take 10 years from now. If you had a child starting school this year, that child will still be at school in 10 years. If your child has just started high school this year, he or she will be finished university in 10 years' time. It's not such a long time. The question about the trade-off between climate and Africa's needs is a very tricky one, that. I mean, obviously, we know that, well, let me rephrase, let me be careful now, with all the diplomacy in the room. We know the number of countries, let's call it the so-called high-income countries, for a good 100 years, in their quest for growth and industrialization, arguably made a bit of a mess in terms of Mother Nature, helping to co-create our current climate crisis. And now I think it's rather ironic that the very same countries are now begging Africa and other parts of the world, who are now also showing signs of development, are saying, please, don't industrialize too quickly, don't mess up the environment. He did, but let's pretend that didn't happen. Don't you do it. It's a little bit, I suppose, ironic. But I think it's back to an earlier point. Africa needs to provide solutions for its own problems. And I'm sure they are there. We have the Congo River, so big and powerful. If correctly harnessed, it could meet 2/3 of Africa's freshwater requirements and lots of hydroelectricity. I mean, why do we need to think about other sources of water? We've got it there. And so one could go on. The question about the post-conflict economies, I think Yaki and many others were at great pains to point out, and they would have done more so if there was more time, but there's no such thing as one Africa. There are many Africas, and we recognize that. The 54 different countries, own legacies, own histories, own politics, own economic structure, own vegetation, own climate, and own many other things. And by rights, one should look at each one individually. Each one has its own challenges, its own driving forces, its own futures. Very often, because of not enough time, we tend to generalize and talk about Africa or sub-Saharan Africa. But there can be no doubt that what's being said here and by Yaki in his report and the ISS in their report does apply generically, but each individual country might be a totally different state of affairs. And I'm sure if you click on all the individual countries, you'll find that kind of detail match. I'll stop talking again, sorry.
And let me just add to the responses there, particularly on the youth. Just an observation that the work we do, I agree that the policy, the strategy, and a lot of the formal processes around Agenda 2063 are being driven at a leadership level. But I think at ground level, in terms of realizing those aspirations, or we're calling them moonshots, the youth are very active. youth in communities, youth at local level, but also at regional and global levels as well. And importantly, it's an understanding that the youth are increasingly aware of that the future is theirs to shape, and our work is often around empowering their agency, but also working in a multi-generational context so that we can also absorb the agency of the youth and allow them, if not allow, open the spaces, or at least remove barriers for their participation. In terms of the Anthropocene, I think a key conversation we need to have, even from a foresight perspective, is one on values. We need to ensure that the futures we are thinking around, creating, designing are values-based. And a lot of the challenges around the Anthropocene conversation are because that values conversation is missing. I'm not going to go into it now, but I think it has to do with unpacking extractive economies. It's got to do with unpacking our understanding of our role as a living species on a shared planet, etc. In terms of conflict countries, there is a huge role for foresight to play a role, particularly in diplomacy. And we're finding that here, the key skill is more around mediation and dialogue processes so that the foresight exercise can be implemented. But foresight allows for diplomacy and engagement, intense situation, intense context, in a way that allows, again, to break out of the gridlock of the present and to think about the future. So we've seen that specifically, if you can get together the key conflicting parties in a small room and include the youth in those conversations, there can be some breakthrough interventions there. And finally, just a note, speaking a lot about foresight, but foresight, of course, is in partnership with other intervention strategies as well. And what foresight helps us do is make visible what the barriers are and the opportunities for realizing the futures that we envision. So just to mention, it's not a silver bullet, but it is definitely a mechanism, a methodology, a mindset, and hopefully eventually if we can get anticipatory governance off the ground, it will be a paradigm that will improve the ways in which we live, which shape our society, the way in which we lead our organizations. And I hope that as a foresight community, we can continue to take foresight into the different areas of our expertise so that we can continue to enrich and respond to some of these broader questions from the sector as well.
Okay, I'll take on the environment. So statistics tells us that Africa accounts for 60% of the global green energy resources, particular power, in particular solar. But only 1% of solar PVs are installed currently. So it means there's a potential of 49%, which can work towards the environmental sustainability initiative. Then we come to the critical minerals that are required for green energy transition. 70% of world's cobalt is in DR Congo. We have about 7% of lithium in Zimbabwe. 3% of should be bauxite in Guinea. Mozambique is another critical mineral. But what is missing in that is that these are resources that needs to be processed to ensure green industrialization in Africa. Plans are there for beneficiation, but finances are not. So that's a call for action. Then Alice wrote another interesting blog about the issue of environment. You say, why are we punished in Africa of this global emission, if the traditional investors, if the traditional industrializers, actually industrialized through emissions? After all, Africa is the least global emitter in the world. Half of the global emissions are from China, which currently is the largest manufacturer in the world. 30% of the manufactured goods globally, they are manufactured from China. about 8% ahead of United States. So it's a two side of the coin. To say in as much as environmental sustainability is an agenda that all countries should follow, but I'm sure there should some fairness attached to it. We also need to industrialize, and with only solar, the reality is that we can't. Only solar and wind. We need those fossil fuels to drive our industrial base. Perhaps the narrative should change towards leapfrogging the existing power stations, not to emit as much compared to the tradition. But to bring to stop is a no, and it won't take Africa anywhere. So we have on our website, we have the large infrastructure and leapfrogging scenario that takes all that into account. And in as much as we also promote the implementation of the green energy transition, but our argument is that we cannot make it with the green energy alone.
Thank you. I think we have to move the rest of the conversations outside. I think we've covered a lot. We've covered foresight, both how it's evolved, the opportunities and values it has, as well as still some challenges that we face. We've also covered broad topics around African futures. And I think, like I said, we could go on forever. But just due to time, I think I'd like to close off here and thank you guys for the thoughtful questions and for enriching the discussion today. I'd also like to then just take this opportunity again to thank our partners and donors, the governments of the Netherlands and Sweden, the Hans Seidel Foundation, Humanity United, and Oda Nepad. And finally, thank you to all of you who are here with us in the room today, as well as our online participants. Please remember to also join us tomorrow for the second day of the conference. It's fully online, and if you haven't already, please register on our website. So thank you once again for your time, your insights, and your imagination. May we carry this spirit forward in action, shaping the future of Africa together. Thank you. I forgot to mention as well, for our in-person guests, we do have a reception downstairs. So please join us there where we can continue these conversations and questions together. Thank you.